This presentation explores the lived experience of autistic children who attend boxing classes in the inner city of Johannesburg. I embarked on my PhD research as I wanted to explore a new way of understanding the lived experience of atypical children. Children diagnosed with learning disabilities, developmental challenges, or on the autism spectrum are often described using a biomedical model, where their challenges are defined as diseases or disorders in need of remediation or eradication. The social model of disability challenges the medical model and tries to understand how perceptions of disability impact on a person's life, their identity, and how society disables them. New models in the sphere of autism have tried to integrate these two perspectives, as shown by the Rebecca Burgess Understanding the Spectrum illustration on this page, where she visualizes the multitude of challenges that an autistic person has to deal with every day. After 2 years of observing an initial cohort of 9 children diagnosed variously with learning disabilities, developmental delays, or on the autism spectrum, I developed a new model that identifies key stages of atypical engagement with the world. These 7 stages of engagement or phenomena include presence, or how the child shows up in the world, how they perceive their world, how they control themselves in that world, how they participate in the world, how they allow for flow in their lives, how they communicated, and how they adapted to changing environments. My observational work in the autism boxing program focused primarily on trying to understand the stages of perception, control, and participation. What is critical to understand is that at each of these stages, the children are experiencing a multitude of comorbid challenges that they are having to deal with whilst perceiving their world, controlling their bodies and emotions, and ultimately engaging to the best of their ability in the world around them. This can often be very overwhelming for them. Using participant observation as my primary methodology, I spent a year observing a range of children aged 10 to 21 years to understand their sensory experience of their world. The boxing gym had a distinct ritual that the children engaged in, from greetings and preparation to the classes themselves, and then to their final reintegration back into their school classes. Each stage of this ritual presented profound benefits for the children. I formed part of a team that was trying to understand what these benefits were and why the program was having such a positive impact on the children, especially in the realm of social interaction. Although the children were all diagnosed on the autism spectrum, they would often show up and experience the boxing classes in very different ways. Some were extremely sensitive to the often loud and brash environment of the boxing gym, actively avoiding the intense sensory input, whilst others would crash around the gym, banging into other children, equipment, mouthing their boxing gloves, and generally seeking as much sensory input as possible. A typical comorbid challenge experienced by the children was sensory processing disorder, which relates to internal and external sensory perception, discrimination, processing, and modulation. We are often familiar with our 5 external sensory systems of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. However, our proprioceptive and vestibular systems, which manage our sense of body and space and balance, posture, motion, and equilibrium respectively, are also crucial when engaging with the world. What is less well known are our interoceptive sensory systems, which help us understand our internal sensory messaging. This includes our somatosensory systems, genital and urogenital systems, gastrointestinal systems, cardiovascular, respiratory and chemoreceptive systems, our endocrine system, central nervous and nociceptive systems, and finally our thermoregulatory systems. Amongst all atypical children I observed throughout my research, engaging with each of these systems was challenging, and rather than automatic, they often had to consciously check in with their body to assess how they were feeling or experiencing their world. With the help from the coaches and occupational therapists that supported them, I developed a chart of all the sensory systems that were impacted by the ritual contained in the boxing class. In addition to the sensory systems mentioned before, this included issues such as postural stability, motor planning, bilateral integration of body movements, and midline crossing from left to right or vice versa. It was not unusual in the class for many of the children to literally stop breathing. I would observe a panic-stricken look on their faces until the coach reminded them to breathe, often encouraging them to put their hands on their chests or stomach so that they could feel the air moving in and out of their body. This detailed understanding of sensory systems allowed me to observe the children's atypical engagement with their environment. Of particular interest was how the children interacted with the boxing bags, which they would hit or hug intermittently throughout the class. The children were asked to measure the distance of their punch to the bag before starting their various boxing combinations. They would stand with their arm extended, but often struggle to interpret where their boxing glove ended and the bag began. This was just one example of how the children struggled with bodily boundaries. A further example were the pictures that some of the children drew of their bodies when they were feeling unhappy. In each of these pictures, the children illustrated how they were not feeling optimal. It was as though their bodies had become permeable. They felt as though they were spilling out into the world, or conversely, that the world was invading them. Before an atypical child can even perceive their world, they are dealing with several barriers. These barriers to perception include their intense experience of pain, challenges with incontinence, allergies, sensory processing, dyspraxia, alexithymia, or the ability to regulate their emotions, prosopagnosia or face blindness, and a distinct lack of habitus. As one mother of an autistic son explained, imagine waking up every morning and everything is completely new to you. You have to learn everything again as if for the first time. This is what it's like for him waking up every morning. It's like waking up in a stranger's body, in a strange world, and it is very disconcerting for him. The apparent permeable nature of their bodies created a need to enforce physical, emotional, and social boundaries for self-protection and energy preservation. An inability to reinforce these bodily boundaries often led to a sensory meltdown, as the children experienced a sympathetic nervous response to their environment, most commonly described as fight or flight, but which could also include freeze and flop, where the child would be unable to respond to their environment and quite literally shut down physically and emotionally. An important lens through which to observe the atypical lived experience is thus through the spectrum of how the children engaged or disengaged from their world. Depending on their level of resilience and how they've managed their various sensory inputs or barriers to this, they may be present to or absent from their world. They may perceive, process, and experience their world, or be oblivious to it and actively try to avoid it. They may be able to control and regulate their bodies and emotions, or they may appear uncontrolled and powerless to enact this. They may be focused and attentive, or unfocused and seemingly neglectful. They may allow their lives to flow, or become stuck and to disrupt the flow of their lives. They may be able to express themselves and to communicate, or to be entirely unable to communicate with the world around them. And finally, they may be flexible and adaptable to change, or be completely inflexible and do everything in their power to limit the change in their world. The boxing classes provided the children with a unique environment that enabled them to reconnect with their bodies and engage their parasympathetic nervous system of rest and digest. Beyond the boxing classes, I observed similar therapeutic benefits when the children spent time in sensory rooms and even in their favorite online environment, such as Minecraft. Each provided a challenging yet safe and contained space for the children to explore and reinforce their bodily boundaries. In these spaces, the children were able to reconnect with their bodies, to claim a sense of control, and to assist them in participating positively in their world. Ultimately, they allowed the children to breathe easier. By the end of the boxing session, the children would collapse on the floor in a corpse yoga position, their bodies exhausted but emotionally happy and content. Rather than being disconnected from their bodies as they had when they arrived, the children appeared completely connected to them. The coaches and occupational therapists would walk around the children, crossing their arms over their chests and pushing down hard to give deep pressure to all the major muscle groups. This was usually accompanied by gurgles of pleasure from the children. Lenore Manderson notes, "We take our bodies for granted, attending to them only when there is unpredictable, marked discomfort, pain, anomaly, or distress. However, for atypical children, this is their constant lived reality. Unable to rely on unconscious, perceptive, kinesthetic, and proprioceptive responses, the children are constantly made aware of and have to sustain their bodily boundaries. They often appear to question where their body ends and the world begins. Their day-to-day lived experience becomes an endless battle or balancing act to protect or reinforce these bodily boundaries. They sometimes need to think hard about just taking another breath." Thank you for your time and attention.